Hey everybody, welcome back to Race of History. We're going to get into a video today that I wanted to hit while I was doing my reading and watching of videos kind of off channel. I had said on the video yesterday and day before yesterday, I had been looking into end of war and post war Nazi leaders basically, and the Nuremberg Trial and the Clausewitz and, a whole different range of things from the end of the war and right after the war, but specifically to do with high ranking Nazis. And I wanted to get into a video on the Nuremberg trial before I kind of moved off of that subject onto something else. So we're going to do this today. I will get the Sabaton history video out tomorrow, and I will try to get the next part of the 1918 pandemic series video out tomorrow also. With it being Easter, I may not get both out, but I for sure will get the Sabaton history out tomorrow. But with all that being said, let's get into it. The Nuremberg trial.
The Nuremberg Trial saw the end of a regime that caused the Holocaust, and it was the first time in history where an international court sentenced people to prison and to death. It would later set the stage for an International Court of Justice, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and 2 Geneva Conventions. Germany started the Second World War when it invaded Poland, and eventually attacked over half a dozen countries throughout the continent. But by 1943 the tide of war had turned. The Soviet Union was beginning to push back at Leningrad, Moscow, and Stalingrad, while the British meanwhile had beaten back the German air raids and pushed the Axis powers out of Africa. So the leaders of the major Allied powers came together to discuss the state of the world after World War II had ended. Stalin of the Soviet Union, Roosevelt of the USA, and Churchill of the United Kingdom discussed creating the United Nations, the D-Day invasions, and dividing Germany up into 4 occupation zones. Because Germany will be divided. But that was not all. Over the course of World War II, it became apparent that Germany committed atrocities on a massive scale. The night raids, the forced deportations, the mass genocide. There was only one question on everybody's mind. How do you punish acts that are this evil? To this question, there were basically only 3 answers. The first was to do nothing. To let all the atrocities, all the death, all the destruction go unpunished. But how could any country consent to such a course of action? How could the far-off USA, the invaded Soviet Union, or the occupied Czechoslovakia consent to such a course of action? The second option was to put all the perpetrators to death through executive action, to simply give the command to kill thousands of people, regardless of whether they committed any war crimes or not. But this action was disliked by both Roosevelt and Churchill at the time, and so eventually, by the end...
Yeah, Churchill wanted, at least initially, Churchill was on the side of, I think the quote was, what should be done with Nazi leadership, and he said, the quote is, they should be summarily executed. So initially, Churchill was not totally against execution as a punishment, but not for a whole range of individuals. It was for very specific Nazi leaders, and he felt like, yeah, like let's just kill them and then that'll be it. And in fact, I would say in some cases that's kind of the more popular opinion going into the trial, certainly before the trial starts. The Soviet Union wants their pound of flesh, right? They have paid an enormous cost of this war, especially human cost, and they want it paid back in blood, right? I mean, and it's hard to argue with that, to be completely honest. And so the thought process kind of is like, why would we go out of our way to do something with these men that they never gave their victims, like they didn't give their victims trials or the ability to like mount a defense or anything like that. Like, so why would we give it to them? Um, you can kind of see, honestly, this is why this is such an interesting subject to me, is because you can kind of see it from all different sides. You kind of, not that you necessarily agree with all the sides, but you see the rationalization and why that particular viewpoint is what it is.
End of the war, a third option was chosen: justice through persecution. It was decided that the perpetrators of the Second World War and of the Holocaust would be dealt a fairness and justice that they themselves destroyed in Germany. But that brought up the next question. How do you punish someone from another sovereign country for crimes that are not actually illegal in that country? The Allied powers answered this question with the London Charter of the International Military Tribunal. This charter laid out a system where 4 different legal codes of France, the Soviet Union, the United States, and the United Kingdom would be incorporated into a single tribunal. There were prosecutors and defense attorneys according to British and US laws, but decisions and sentences were imposed by a group of judges according to French and Soviet legislation. Furthermore, 4 types of crimes were determined that a person could be indicted for. The first is crimes against peace, which included planning, initiating, and waging wars of aggression or wars in violation of international treaties. The second is crimes against humanity, such as extermination, deportation, and genocide. The third is war crimes. This basically meant a violation of the rules of war that were set before the Second World War, such as executing prisoners. The fourth crime is a common plan or conspiracy to commit any of the 3 aforementioned crimes.
Okay, so I want to know kind of what everybody thinks about this, because this is kind of a tricky situation, right? I don't know if there has ever been a war in the history of humanity where war crimes were not committed ever, right? War crimes are prevalent in all warfare. Um, Offensive war, which is the crimes against peace. Offensive wars are prevalent throughout human history. They happen all the time, right? Um, it's that one in particular is such a weird one to put in there, for at least in my opinion, because any war is offensive, right? Like you could say the US getting into World War II was not an offensive war. Sure, but the war in itself is started by somebody on the offensive. And so at any case of warfare, there's going to be somebody on the offensive, and there's always war. So that's a weird one to me. Um, I feel like what should have been very like narrowly focused on was the crimes against humanity and the conspiracy for the crimes against humanity. I feel like that was the thing that was the biggest deal. That was the thing that was the most outrageous. Um, that was the thing that really made the Nazis different, right? Like when you look back historically, sure, they committed war crimes and they had like things that the wolf packs did that were not technically legal and things like that. But like I said, all warfare has that. Offensive war, that's super common. It's the thing that sets the Nazis apart are the atrocities, right? And so zero in on that. Like make it about the atrocities. I feel like they did something similar to this that they did in the Treaty of Versailles with World War One. And that was they wanted to pin the entire war and all of the effects on Germany. And I feel like this could have been a much more successful trial in general, certainly historical trial, had they focused on crimes against humanity.
After all, simply because you didn't put anyone in the gas chambers yourself doesn't mean you're not guilty of creating the system leading to such genocide. It would be possible for someone to be indicted for any or all of these crimes. For example, Wilhelm Keitel, who was the de facto head of the German military during the war, was indicted for all 4 crimes. He was found guilty on all 4 charges at the Nuremberg Trial and sentenced to death. Or take the case of Julius Streicher, publisher of an anti-Semitic newspaper. He was only indicted for conspiracy and crimes against humanity, and he would only be found guilty of the latter, although he too would be sentenced to death for that crime. It is important to note that this is not the only trial. There were several others, such as the doctor's trial and the judge's trial. The Nuremberg trial, however, was only for the worst offenders. Those who had created the system of oppression and extermination in Germany and its occupying territories. One of such worst offenders is Wilhelm Frick, Minister of the Interior and co-author of anti-Semitic laws imposed in Germany before the war. Or Ernst Kaltenbrunner, the highest-ranking SS officer tried at Nuremberg and chief of the intelligence, Gestapo and criminal police. Both of them would be found guilty and both of them would be sentenced to death. In total, 24 men would be indicted at the trial. Of these 24, there are 3 special cases we need to discuss first. First is Martin Bormann, who was party secretary. He was absent at the trial. He would be found guilty and sentenced to death in absentia. However, it would be discovered in 1972 that he had actually died a few days before the war had ended, but his body wasn't identified before then. There's also the case of Gustav Krupp von Bohlen und Halbach, a major industrialist. He was found medically unfit for trial and passed away in 1950 without sentencing. And thirdly is the case of Robert Ley, head of the German trade unions. He believed that, as the loser in the war, he ought to just be shot rather than to be brought before a tribunal like a criminal. Ley therefore strangled himself in his cell 3 days after receiving his indictment. The trial was now almost ready to begin. The war was over, the men had been captured, and the crimes were determined. But there was one more obstacle to overcome before the trial could commence, and that was the problem of language. This trial was held between French, English, Russian and German speakers. How were they going to communicate efficiently with each other? IBM came up with a brilliant system that we still use today: simultaneous interpretation. This is the technique where interpreters translate what is being said while it is being said, and then everybody can listen to the translation in their own native language directly via headphones. This is how, for example, the United Nations and the European Parliament work today. Now it was time for the trial to commence. Each of the 4 countries provided a prosecutor and a team of experts behind them. The defendants were entitled to receive a copy of the indictment made against them, any relevant explanation about the indictments, and to be represented by a lawyer of their choice. And of course, the defendants chose the best German lawyers they could possibly find. To give an example of how good these lawyers are, let's look at the case of Admiral Karl Dönitz, head of the German Navy from...
Yep, this is a super well-known, part of the case, where his attorney is, really is brilliant. There's interviews with him. I can't think of his name off the top of my head, but the guy really is incredibly, incredibly intelligent, the lawyer for Dönitz. He's a Nazi, the lawyer is, and he doesn't really hide it. But he's incredibly smart, and you can see from what he's about to explain right here.
1943 onward. He was indicted because he had ordered his submarines not to help the survivors of any sinking ship, instead letting them drown in the Atlantic Ocean. This was in clear violation of the Second London Naval Treaty. His lawyer, however, would save his life. He presented evidence that the USA had committed the exact same breach of the treaty in the Pacific in its war with Japan, and argued that Dönitz should not be convicted for a crime the USA also committed. And it worked. Karl Dönitz was sentenced to only 10 years in prison. He was released in 1956 and died in 1980. When the trial first started,
So that's not exactly the argument that was made. The argument of, like, you did it too was not admissible at Nuremberg. That was not a legitimate defense that could be used. What he argued, and I want to say they even had uh, Nimitz come and essentially like speak on this on behalf of the defense, was that there really were no rules with submarine warfare. Like it wasn't, the rules of war for the submarines weren't really plausible because of the technological advancements of both the submarines and the defenses for the submarines. And so the argument wasn't that they did it too. The argument was like there really aren't rules to guide this. And yes, they did it, but like ask them why, essentially. And the reason why given was because there really wasn't another way to do it. Like you couldn't, as a submarine, you couldn't come up and tell a ship like, "Hey, we've got you in the scope. We've had you dead to rights for the last 30 minutes. Evacuate and we'll, take or scuttle the ship or whatever." You would be shot at, right? Your submarine would be hit and sunk. And so the idea was there's really not anything that can be done here. Not anything practical that can be done here. And so that was more the argument that was made. Like I said, the argument, the just outright argument of you did it too wasn't admissible, which again is another thing that I think they did incorrectly here. And another reason why I feel like they should have specifically narrowed in on the crimes against humanity.
prosecution was afraid there wouldn't be any evidence that these men were responsible for the atrocities committed during the war. But they forgot the German character. The Germans documented everything. 47 crates of binders, 1400 kilograms of party records, and kilometers of film poured in. Therefore, the prosecution decided not to go directly after the greater atrocities of World War II. Instead, they wanted to lay bare the system of conspiracy that would slowly lead to the Second World War and the atrocities committed in them. They wanted to prove that it was these men who created the system that would lead to these atrocities. From the supposed need for breathing room to feed the German people, to the aspiration of the extermination of what they considered an undesirable population. The prosecution pulled out one incriminating document after another, such as a document that showed how they were planning to start a war by whatever means necessary. It is my unalterable decision to squash Czechoslovakia by military means in the near future. It is the job of the political leaders to bring about the military and politically suitable moment. The primary defense of these actions was that they were only made illegal after the crimes had been committed. But the prosecution countered by stating that the first person to be sentenced for murder could just as easily have argued that nobody had ever been sentenced for murder, so why should they? They argued that some crimes are so universally immoral that it shouldn't require a precedent. One of the defendants, Albert Speer, realized that the prosecution, the Allied powers, and the judges wanted to hear an apology, an admission of wrongdoing, an expression of repentance, and so he simply gave them one. He took personal responsibility for the crimes he and his country had committed. While Speer was responsible for ordering the use of hundreds of thousands of slave laborers.
Yeah, it's really hard to get a read on Albert Speer. It's hard to tell whether he's legit or if he's more or less doing what he thinks he has to do to kind of manipulate the situation and get out of it. At least for me, it's kind of hard to tell which side of that he's on. But he does use a ton of this slave labor, right? But there are companies that are still around today. Um, BMW, Mercedes, Bayer. There's a bunch of companies that use this slave labor, right? In fact, you can go on Wikipedia and look up all of the companies that were involved with Nazi Germany and benefited from this slave labor. It is a pretty big list.
He himself was only sentenced to 20 years in prison. He was released in 1966 and died in 1981. Now that the prosecution had presented that there was indeed a common conspiracy against peace and certain types of people, they continued with the greater atrocities of the war. They showed a documentary about the concentration camps, which I will not show here because I do not want any of my audience to involuntarily see the horrific acts depicted in them. If you do want to see the evidence, it is available on the English Wikipedia page on the Nuremberg Trials, and I will leave a link in the description. This film showed the horrors of the concentration camps, the piles of bodies, the gas chambers, the unimaginable suffering. People in the courtroom cried, some even fainted. The defense of these men on trial could largely be summed up as, "I was just following orders." The prosecution deconstructed that argument, stating that men who commit crimes cannot plea as a defense that they committed them in uniform. Military men are not above and beyond the moral requirements that apply to others, incapable of exercising moral judgment on their own. They pointed out that another German general, Erwin Rommel, had been ordered to kill any commandos that he had or would capture, but Rommel had burned the order, showing that even a high-ranking general was able to exercise moral judgment and disobey immoral orders. As the trial progressed, a very curious case became clear, that of Hjalmar Schacht. Schacht was a prominent banker and economist in Germany, having served as president of the central bank and economics minister. While an important figure before the war, he had lost all his power by the time it started, and had even been in contact with resistance leaders until he himself was put in a concentration camp. In the end, he was acquitted and set free, and would go on advising developing countries on matters of finance and economics, and passed away in 1970. By now, all the evidence had been presented, and the accused had been given the opportunity to defend themselves. It was now time to pass judgment. It took the judges 2 days to determine the sentences of these 24 men. 12 were sentenced to death by hanging, 7 were sent to prison, 3 were acquitted, and 2 were left without a decision. Of those men sentenced to death who have not yet been named in this video are Hans Frank, Governor General of occupied Poland; Alfred Jodl, a general in the German military who signed the summary execution of the Allied commandos and Soviet commissars; Joachim von Ribbentrop, ambassador to the UK and later Minister of Foreign Affairs. He was responsible for a treaty that divided Poland up between Germany and the Soviet Union.
Yeah, but is it... I don't know. Again, I know this is a really uneasy piece here between the Allies and the Soviet Union, and that they're trying to make the best out of a bad situation. But they split it with the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union is on the other side of this trial. Again, just another reason why I feel like the atrocities and the conspiracy to commit the atrocities should have been heavily, heavily zeroed in on. Like, you don't necessarily have to drop everything else. If there's some sort of extenuating circumstances, you could bring the other stuff in. But really, I feel like the atrocities should have been much more the overall focal point of the trial.
Alfred Rosenberg, Minister of Eastern Occupied Territories; Fritz Sauckel, head of the slave labor program; Arthur Sees Inquart, commander of the occupied Netherlands; and Hermann Göring. We'll come back to him in a little bit. The men sentenced to prison who have not yet been named: Walter Funk, Minister of Economics and sentenced to life imprisonment, but released due to ill health in 1957 and passed away in 1960. Konstantin von Neurath, Minister of Foreign Affairs and Reich Protector of Bohemia and Moravia, and resigned in 1943, sentenced to 15 years in prison, but released in 1954 due to ill health, and passed away in 1956. Erich Raeder, Commander-in-Chief of the German Navy until his retirement in 1943, sentenced to life imprisonment, but released in 1955 due to ill health, and passed away in 1960. Baldur von Schirach, head of the party's youth division until 1940, sentenced to 20 years in prison and passed away in 1974. And Rudolf Hess. We'll also get back to him later. Out of the 3 men who were acquitted, there was the previously named Schacht, but also Hans Fritzsche, a popular radio commentator and head of the news division of the propaganda ministry. His crimes were not deemed severe enough for this tribunal, and he would later be sentenced to 9 years in prison at a different trial. He would be released in 1950 due to ill health and died in 1953. And there is Franz von Papen. He served as the Chancellor and Vice-Chancellor of Germany, was an ambassador to Austria and later Turkey. He was acquitted at Nuremberg. However, he would later be sentenced to 8 years in prison for his actions during the war. He appealed that decision and was once again acquitted after serving only 2 years in prison, and passed away in 1969. The hangings of those sentenced to death would take place 2 weeks later. Hermann Göring, the highest-ranking man on trial, took one last act of defiance by committing suicide. He was commander of the Air Force, de facto head of the economy, and the original head of the Gestapo. He was found guilty on all charges and sentenced to death. The hangings were supposed to be done via the standard drop method, where the goal is to break the neck so the person dies instantly instead of suffering a slow strangulation. But some of the hangings were botched and took several minutes of strangulation.
Yeah, Imp sent me a video on this on Discord the other day about the guy who was in charge of doing the hangings. Wow. The dude is like some farm boy from Kansas who failed upwards forever. His whole life just failed upwards. And somehow is in charge of hanging these super infamous war criminals from the trial. And he botches it, right? Which, like, of course he does. Because the whole story's crazy. I'll put the link to the video down below about the guy who was in charge of this. But the story is insane. But yeah, needless to say, he was a dummy and they were definitely botched. Although afterwards, he like is giving himself a pat on the back and is like, swell job. I got all, whatever in however much time it was just the whole thing's bizarre.
Strangulation before they died. Von Ribbentrop took 17 minutes to die. Jodl, 18. And Keidel, 28. The bodies were then cremated and the ashes dumped into the river. The last one of these men to die was Rudolf Hess. He flew to Scotland in 1941 to negotiate a peace treaty with the British, but was instead imprisoned. Thus, he didn't participate in many of the atrocities. He was sentenced to life imprisonment and died in 1987 when he strangled himself at the age of 93. The prison was demolished to prevent it from becoming a shrine to followers of that toxic ideology, but instead his burial site became a destination for yearly pilgrimages by neo-Nazis. So when the lease on his burial site ended in 2011, his grave was reopened, his remains cremated, and his ashes scattered at the sea. And so ended the regime that started the Second World War in Europe, committed genocide with a brutality rarely seen in history, and took the lives of 50 to 56 million people. This video was only a summary of the Nuremberg trials. I had to leave out many things, such as the fact that the Soviet Union committed many of the same atrocities, but were not put on trial, or why Nuremberg was chosen as the location. Therefore, if you're interested in reading more about the topic, I will provide a few sources down below where you can learn more about the subject. If you like this video, please give it a...
Okay, so that was the Nuremberg trial. This is a good video, and I'm curious what everybody thinks about all this stuff. Yeah, you can understand why the Soviets, weren't super in favor of a trial. Like I said, they had bore the human cost, or a lot of the human cost of this war, and they were setting a precedent for international legal action for some of the exact same atrocities that they were also committing and would commit. So, kind of a weird spot there for the USSR, and kind of a weird spot there for everybody, because of what the Allies think of the USSR. So, yeah, just another kind of bizarre part of this whole thing. But overall, I think they had to come up with this from scratch, right? The idea is that when the war ends, what do you do? Like there is no blueprint for something like this, right? So everything is done from scratch. Uh, whether there's going to be defense attorneys, judges, everything from the trial is from scratch. And it's kind of trying to bring this new idea of like international accountability into, you know, into being. Um, and like I said, there's things that I think should have been done differently, but overall, I think the idea that they were trying to kind of show with having a trial was a good one. Certainly better than, you know, just having all of these guys put in front of a firing squad right off the bat. I think there was a kind of a more important message and goal overall than just that. So, great video. As always, like, comment, subscribe. Help me keep building the channel over here. I will put the link to the Discord down below, and I will see you all next time.